Preview. Hola, ¿qué tal? Bienvenidos a este nuevo episodio del Cine de Arte. Yo soy Román Rangel y en esta ocasión pues me acompaña pues quien es un gran amigo, un cineasta y pues nuestro primer invitado internacional también. Él es Mak CK o Mak CK y él nos acompaña desde la tierra lejana de Singapur. Mak, how are you?
Hi, Roman. I'm great. It's morning here, so good morning.
It was crazy when you told me that it was 13 hours. I always forget that. So it's literally the farthest, like, I'm sure it's not the farthest from Mexico, but it's pretty far go to Singapore, right?
Yeah, it's about 3 flights if you live in Mexico City.
You know, most people, I think, that don't know Singapore, that they've never been, including me, obviously. They always think of Singapore from Crazy Rich Asians. It's
Right.
this huge, exotic, rich, vast country that, is it any, do you think it's accurate or it's just a lot of Hollywood thing, you know?
No, I think like with most media portrayals, right, you have so many different sides to choose. So there is that side of Singapore, which I don't belong to. But it's just like, when I tell family and friends I lived in Mexico, they just think, dry, hot desert and cacti. Because growing up watching cartoons and whatever little movies exposure they had to Mexican culture, it was pretty much that. So you can't really say Mexico is not desert, but there's so much obviously more than desert. So
I've often like spoken to people that don't know Mexico, and that's exactly how they think of it. Like sort of the Wild West, also because it's a lot of the organized crime here in Mexico. So they think that even going to a very touristy place like the beach in Acapulco, Huatulco, Cancun, whatever, it's a very dangerous endeavor for tourists, and a lot of them have like sort of hesitation to come. The first time you came to Mexico, be honest, did you were expecting that a little bit?
no, I mean, okay, it's quite funny because so me and my partner we were traveling in Latin America for 3 months before Mexico, and then we met a couple in Colombia, and they are European, I think Belgians, and they said that they spent all their vacations for the past 5 years traveling to different parts of Latin America. So they know it quite well. And they were like, don't, of all the places in Latin America, don't go to Mexico. And if you do, make sure you have a gun. And we're like,
What?
really? Yeah, we're like, really? Because I didn't have Mexican friends then to verify. But I was a fan. I'm a big fan of Gael Garcia Bernal, so I watch almost all his movies. So it's like that's not the Mexico I see through his films. So obviously, there was some confusion. But I know better than to assume that one country the size of Mexico, no less, can be just one thing.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people have different experiences based on their own life. Like even people that lived here in Mexico, if you lived or closer to the border with states, they have a very, very different experience than people where I live, which is like the center of Mexico, more or less. So yeah, I can believe that maybe someone who told you that about having a gun, maybe they had a very bad experience, so they
Yeah.
obviously recommended you to be
Be
safe.
safe.
But it's funny because when I went to Argentina on a traveling trip, the the taxi driver told us that we wanted to go to a very um what I thought originally was a touristy place where all the ships came by, the sort of like a port in the city in
Yeah.
Buenos Aires. And he told us it was like 6 o'clock, and he told us, no, I'm not going over there. And we were like, we read online that this is like a tourist site. And he was talking like it was like a den for criminals, right? And he was like, I can only leave you like 3 blocks before, and you can just walk, but I'm not risking my life. And he was just complaining about the youth in Argentina, how violent it had become. And I know that a lot of the struggles that have been happening since the like an economic crisis happened in Argentina. But it's very funny. I did not assume, like, coming from Mexico, it was just like, oh, come on, we understand the violent nature of the country we live in, but I think that each person has a different experience.
Yeah.
So I don't
Yeah.
know if like if I go to Singapore, is there someone gonna tell me, oh, it's very violent in certain part of Singapore, or they don't have that conception of their own country? I don't know.
No, I think it's because Singapore is so small. I mean, Singapore is smaller than Mexico City. So because of its size, there is a lot more consensus about what things are. We don't have the concept of neighborhoods, like, oh, that neighborhood is rough, or we don't have the idea of, in that part of the country people speak like that because it's so small. It's like it takes 1 hour to drive from east to west. So yeah, I mean, growing up in a country like that, you assume that most countries are like yours, and obviously when you start traveling and studying, you realize that, wow, there are things called states. Like, you can actually go to a different state. So Mexico was everything and more, which I wanted to experience from a big country.
We're going to talk about a little later about Mexico, particularly because you've been here quite a bit now. But I forgot to ask you a question that I usually ask every guest I have for the show. I usually ask if they remember a time in their life when they can say, "Oh, this is an experience I had that made me love cinema." And in your case, I wanted to ask you, if do you remember when did your love for filmmaking start? And then what drew you particularly to nonfiction?
Right. I have the answer, and I think I'm very lucky to have the answer, because that moment of that period in my life propelled me to know straight away that this was what I was going to dedicate my life to doing professionally. So I was about 8, I believe, and there was a VCR, and we have like a bunch of VHS tapes. And the tape that we played over and over again was Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. We played at least 30 times a year, I imagine. And it was just people go to their comfort food, like in terms of the cartoons. My go-to was Indiana Jones. And I didn't know then that I was going to be a filmmaker. I was a bit too young. But I knew then that I was very captivated by what was in a box on TV. And I think very soon after, I realized that storytelling ability was very powerful, to make a Chinese Singaporean child from a regular income family be captivated like that by just those images, and that story made me realize that cinema was everything. I wanted to escape. Maybe escape is not the right word, but I led a very simple, modest life growing up. So your life was pretty much your neighborhood, like most kids, I guess. But then that box transported me to any dimension I wanted to enter. So I think then at about 14, I was in secondary school. I joined the drama club just simply because that was the closest thing to media at that time. And I remember telling my drama club teacher that I wanted to be a director when I grow up. I wanted to make movies. And she was so worried for me. Bless her. She was so worried that I was going to lead a life of poverty and as a struggling artist. So she requested to call my parents at home so that they can be forewarned and that they can start encouraging and advising me to take a different route in life. So that is a very strong memory I have. I always go back to that.
Just on a side note, for Indiana Jones, do you remember the kid who played Short Round? I think it was
Of course.
Jonathan Kekwan, I think his name was. Do you know that he returned to acting this year with this film called Everything Everywhere All at Once?
Yeah, I think he's coming up in a new series called Asian Americans as well, with Michelle Yeoh and a bunch of iconic Asian American actors.
so amazing that to see someone that you saw as a child actor and now coming back to make movies
Yeah.
and series. It's just like, oh, I would love to see if, like, why did he take a break and now how is he coming back? It would be an amazing. But yeah, like Indiana Jones for me was also very important. Like I saw it as a kid. It was one of my dad's favorite film, particularly number three, like the Last Crusade. That was like my dad's favorite film, so it was very influential. Of course, Steven Spielberg, I think it's been an influence for probably every filmmaker alive, right? Has obviously loved any kind of film by Spielberg. But how was it in Singapore, the industry of filmmakers? Like, were you growing up, were you seeing a lot of films from Singapore, or they were imports from the Chinese market, like films from Hong Kong or other parts of China? Or how was the film industry in Singapore?
It was pretty much non-existent. I didn't grow up watching Singaporean movies. They were definitely not showing in the cinemas. Um, so this was during the 80s, and only in the 90s did indie filmmakers start to um, make waves. But it was still, maybe there was one celebrated film that year, and then if we are lucky, one a year. And then people are doing this stuff, but they don't really make it to the mainstream audience. So I didn't really know the path. Um, there wasn't a film school you go to per se. There wasn't a production company you can go to. It was just um, a desert for aspiring filmmakers in terms of finding a well-trodden path.
Yeah, in Mexico, it's been like, I don't know if in the actuality, like right now, we can see more films from Singapore in your case, but in Mexico, there was also this weird sort of period where the decade, I think in the 80s or 90s, like there were very few Mexican films, and a lot of the films were very like cheap, vulgar comedies. There weren't really any type of artistic value to most of them. So I don't know if there was like something that afterwards made it to have a, like a larger industry. If in the 80s nothing was produced, maybe in the 90s or the early 2000s, you get to see more Singapore films. So I can imagine, I can relate, like if they were told you that being a filmmaker was not really the best thing because there's obviously not a lot of films being made in Singapore, were you like recommending to either go abroad to learn the craft of filmmaking? Was that like the path you already chosen when you wanted to study to be a filmmaker?
So I was the first university graduate in my family.
Wow.
Um, my both parents came from very, very humble beginnings. Um, so the thought of making films as a profession was like, is probably a bit like me saying I want to be an astronaut. Um, so, but because they knew so little about the possibilities or the tangible ways to achieve these possibilities, it also freed me of um, realism. You know, it's not like they are accomplished, maybe white collar workers, and they could say, oh, you know, it's really tough. They didn't know better in a way, and so didn't I. So I wasn't constrained in my ability to dream about what I want to do. So obviously, you grow up here, and then you start to realize, okay, then realistically, how do I get there? So you know, you hear about USC going to California to study and all that, but there wasn't a possibility financially for me to be able to do that. So I just went to the only university program that was related to media at that time, and it was a very elementary media learning in terms of filmmaking institution. So that was the only one available, and that was the one I went to. Um, yeah.
And when you start studying, was that when you became aware of nonfiction, of documentary cinema? Or when was your first like breakthrough in regards to saying, oh, I were you like conscious before that there were actually documentaries, or where you did not understand like, oh, narrative filmmaking versus nonfiction?
Yeah, but the definition of non-fiction or documentaries per se used to be simply just what was in Discovery Channel and Net Geo. Um, the concept of creative documentaries where it's a feature-length film and you don't need to have ad breaks and you don't need a travel guide or you don't need a voiceover, a voice of God telling you what to process on screen was foreign to me until late in my career, um, until maybe in my late 20s. So I, I learned about this world through a documentary workshop I attended abroad. And then I met fellow filmmakers. I was exposed to what documentaries could be. I mean, up to that point, I was working for production companies making non-fiction or factual content for TV. So travel shows, food shows, cooking shows, info entertainment shows. Um, so those were my concept of what documentaries were. And then when I went to the workshop, I realized that we can do a lot more. You can be as creative as, if not more than narrative fiction films. And that's when I guess that was when I was hooked. Because before that, I just thought, I'm just gonna work in media long enough to kind of build up my skills and maybe find a way to pitch and get money to make my first fiction film, my directorial debut. But then when I realized that there's this world of creative documentary cinema, I realized that that was probably a faster way I could become a filmmaker because, you need a lot less resources um, to be a filmmaker in factual.
And speaking about the documentaries, which we mostly relate with television documentaries, you've worked for those brands, right? You worked for National Geographic, you worked for Discovery, for History, etc. So whenever you're working for a big media outlet, let's say, or even a newscast, what do you find that is the type of daily routine for those types of works versus the feature films that you've already done?
I think the biggest difference for me is time and money. Money they are not short of. I mean, back in the good old days, a discovery program can cost maybe $200,000. I mean, the budget to make it, which is not little for a documentary film, even. But in terms of time, they would expect it to be made in a stipulated within a stipulated time. There are milestones to hit. So you start shoot here, you must end shoot here, and then there's a post production. It's all very regimented and it's all very formulaic. So there's no room to, hey, I think this story can go this way, or let's completely drop this, or let's reinvent the wheel and not do this instead. So you don't really have a lot of room for that. I mean, it's getting better, but because TV is to, and a lot of cinema is intended for a mass audience. So you always go for the lowest common denominator that attracts viewers mostly. And because of that, a lot of things are considered too alternative, too experimental, too maybe not. Because a lot of people's jobs and bonuses and promotions were on the line, that they can't just veer away from what the brand of the channel is or even what brand of TV is. So that constraint obviously puts you into a small box, and you can be as creative as you want, but it is all within the confines of that box.
I think that for someone who doesn't know, it might seem like a limitation, but I've seen you work, and I find that your mentality as a filmmaker, your discipline, at least what I've seen from my perspective, is that you have a great work ethic, and you work very fast because you know what's a tight schedule, and I think it's taught you a lot about making even your own feature films, that type of work ethic by working on TV, right?
Right. Well, thanks. It's a compliment. I mean, I pride myself in working towards something and with a plan. So I know that I've got peers and friends and filmmakers I've met where they don't like to be constrained in any way because that limits their creativity. Whereas I work better with a plan. We may not stick to the plan, but I like to know going in, how are we going to get the money? How much is it going to cost? Um, how much do we want it to last, and how long can we afford if it overruns? And it's just there's a lot more producer in me to deliver because my whole career is about delivering on time to clients so that they are happy with the work. So when I make films where I'm sort of the boss and I get to decide, I still apply those principles I have so that it keeps myself motivated. It keeps people working with me motivated. It keeps people I'm filming with motivated as well. Because I think everyone likes to know a plan, even though it might be a loose plan.
Yeah, you're a lot more pragmatic in that sense, right? It's better to stick to that plan to just come up with no plan where everybody's just like wondering
Yeah.
what the hell they're gonna do. And I want to talk about the three features that you've already made, which is the world's most fashionable prison, the Little People Big Dreams, and One Taxi Ride. Um, if we were to find like a common thread between those three films, I think that all of them have a sort of activist component to them. So I wanted to ask you, are you drawn to the social issues as much as human stories, or do you think that they all have to correlate whenever you choose a project?
So I made my feature length docs all within a span of just under a decade. And when I made my first film, I just was I was just attracted to the subject matter. I was attracted to the stories and the themes, right? I was just gravitated towards them. I didn't have a plan to say I'm going to make these type of films. And it was almost exactly the same thing with the second doc and then the third film. So it was only after Taxi, my last film, was released. And then I realized that, wow, there is a very strong thread running through them. And I realized that the thread is not so much um, the kind of films I want to make or what films I would like to be defined by, but it was more a reflection of who I am or who I was as well. And I realized that, hey, maybe I was gravitating towards these themes is because I am interested, or it could be I was gravitating towards these protagonists or characters because they are more likely to open up to me, or I was more able to make these characters open up to me as opposed to these characters. And I started thinking about their gender identity, their race, their cultural background, their socioeconomic background. And I realized that it had a lot to do with who I felt comfortable with or who I wanted to get to know and who were most likely to be vulnerable to me on camera. So um, obviously the most superficial or the simplest way to look at it is yes, I'm drawn to human interest stories. Yes, I love social justice in general as a filmmaker, as a person. But then a lot also has to do with why can I make these films that maybe most of other filmmakers may not have um, the access to make. Um, and on the contrary, why are some films so difficult for me to approach? Maybe I just don't have the personality or the characteristics to get those films made as well as another person. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I also feel that there's like a sort of like a challenge in recording in a prison, going to this controversial theme park, recording the testimony of a survivor, a male survivor. So it's all of those things that I feel that they also, it's like the challenge of doing something that it's not very visible within our society, even that even Taxi, that one of the things that certainly is not the focus of the film, but it's certainly one of the main aspects, is that a lot of people haven't even heard of male rape. So it's just bringing something that's not been said before in this style, right? So we can talk about Taxi, but I was very interested in, do you kind of believe in fate, because it's kind of been a little bit of a fateful thing, finding Eric for Taxi, or you finding the theme park for Little People Big Dreams. It's not something that you actively pursue, they just come to you. So do you believe in fate?
I completely believe in fate, or whatever word you want to use that means serendipity, or just blessing, really. I mean, I look at the three films I've made and I just feel really blessed to number one have been able to find these stories. I think you can have all the skills as a filmmaker, as a documentary filmmaker, but if you don't have the right story to exercise those skills on, then they're always going to remain, private and unused. So to have these stories appear in my life, and then to have access to these stories to film them, is really the biggest blessings of my life.
As someone who works in a film festival, I have I'm going to use that word also. I'm very blessed to be able to see so many films and understand stories and stuff. But I'm very interested in crafting a narrative, because it's not even something that's of late, but I've heard a lot about usually the easiest way to make a film, speaking in terms of documentary cinema, is to point the camera at yourself or at your relatives or at your friends and say, hey, I have an amazing story. But it's not really just about the story, not just about the characters. I think it's about creating a strong narrative for that story to be universal. It's not like, I've seen films where I say, oh, you have an awesome family member, you have your uncle has a great story, but it just feels like a home movie. I don't care about those characters that you obviously care about because they're your family. But crafting a narrative for me, and that's where your like work ethic and your ability to do so, it's like anybody could have taken the story of Eric and his family and made some sort of exploitative work or a cheap home film, whatever you want to call it. And I think that the strength of the film is it has a strong narrative. So whenever you're working on the film during the production, are you also very working very closely with a script, or do you have like a little bit of a rundown that's more loose whenever you're shooting the sequences that you want for the film?
I definitely don't have a script. I don't have anything written down, but I'm always looking for the story arc, the narrative arc. I'm always looking for the ending of the film. So I think so my second film, Little People, Big Dreams, is about employees who are little people, who are dwarfs, working in a dwarf theme park like Disney, but you pay money to go in to see little people. So the premise, I knew there was a film based on the premise, but the hardest part was finding the ending. So the lives of our characters will go on usually, but where is the ending for the film? For Taxi, it was the opposite, sort of the opposite. We went in, so One Taxi Ride is about a male rape survivor in Mexico City who hasn't, who hadn't shared anything about what happened to him to people in his life, anyone in his life. So we were filming his journey. And with the ending, you sort of know that the ending is going to be a cathartic moment where he comes out as a survivor to his loved ones. So, but then what what is the journey besides the ending? So that was the challenge for that film. So I think with different films, there are different challenges, but I'm always looking for the beginning and ending. I think the beginning is a bit easier. The beginning is usually the entry point of when I start filming. So the ending is the challenge sometimes. And then filling it up with enough journey enough moments to make it worth the audience's experience, and to obviously last long enough to make it a feature-length film. So that is usually the challenge. So I always go in looking, okay, so we have this in the film, we have this in the card or in the hard disk, and this could be at this part of the film. But then what's going to come before and after? I'm always looking for these moments, and usually they are offshoots. They could be sub characters, or they could be a totally different tangent that brings you back to the main story. So with Eric's family, I was always looking for, are there more stories besides just him being a survivor? Is there a relationship between him and his loved one? Is there a romantic relationship that's about to happen? So I'm always looking for these threads. So I don't really have a script in mind till perhaps 3/4 of my way into completing production, where I know, okay, I've got enough content, I need to start filling up the gaps or wait for one key thing to happen. Whether I know what that is or not depends on the situation. But yeah, that's basically how I map out my story.
It's interesting because it seems to me that you are also thinking like an audience member while making the film. It's
Yeah.
like you're thinking what's going to work, what's the arc, what's especially the ending, because even in fictionalized filmmaking, it always seems like a lot of the films, the weaker point is the conclusion of the story, right? It's like, so, you can see a very good film and the ending is like, oh, it has to be either a very formulaic happy ending. But in the terms of a documentary and in terms of making Taxi, which is a very strong sad story, you like, I feel like it's very hard to conceptualize something that feels like a conclusion when your protagonist is still out there and he has to deal with a lot of trauma. So I find it very interesting that you are thinking about that ending, but in a sense that that catharsis, you are kind of fishing for the cathartic moment that's gonna make the film, like, it's not only going to close the film, but it's going to create that impact with the film, because every screening that we've had Taxi, I feel like the most powerful moment comes at the end. Like, obviously the whole journey caps, but there's like this break, like 2 years after the events that we saw, and then we see the confrontation of Eric with the film and the audience in a sense. But I find it very interesting that you are dealing in terms of like sort of managing, I don't know, audience expectations, if that makes sense. It's like you want to create that moment, but long before you are editing the film. It's almost like you are trying to find that moment as you're making the film, right?
Yeah, I think because I think maybe going back to Indiana Jones and when I was 8, I didn't watch the film to be entertained. I didn't watch the film to learn. I watched the film to experience, right? So whether the experience could be sad or happy or exciting. So it's a bit like going to a theme park and then you pay for a ride. You you want to feel whatever you're looking for, you want to feel. So I think with storytelling, for me, it's the same. You want the audience to be uncomfortable, excited, to feel things that they can't feel in their daily lives per se, and they want that rush within that 90 minutes and 2 hours. So I'm always making films for an audience. And I've had long existential philosophical conversations with filmmakers where they feel the opposite. They're not making for someone. There is a
Yeah.
flame and a story that they want to express, and they're finding ways to express it. They almost negate the existence of an audience. Whereas perhaps I've always entered this craft from the opposite point of view. I'm always thinking, what can I do to give that experience? And at the end of the day, there are investors involved. People are paying tickets. They're, and beyond that, they are offering you a very precious weekend afternoon or weekday night to give your film a chance. And I always feel that I need to honor that and that they should get something worth their while, so to speak. So, and a payoff, which is what we usually call, in our line of work as the ending. Like, what are you going to get out of it from the story has always been key to me. Because the worst feeling I get from a movie in general is when I leave the theater or I shut the laptop going, I just wasted my time. Like, that's it. So many times we enjoy the movie until the last chapter or the last act or the last 10 minutes. And then we feel completely shortchanged. And it's a bit like the Game of Thrones, right? You can be religious and a fanatic for 8 years, and then you watch the last season, and that completely destroys your 8 years of enjoyment. And I've always been very curious why that phenomenon exists. How can you enjoy 8 years, and because of the last year, it almost robs you of those 8 years? So I think that's the power of storytelling. If you don't end your story well, you're in danger of shortchanging and really truly disappointing your audience. So that is important to me.
I couldn't agree more. It's like I've also spoken about this with friends and people. The whole idea of author theory, in the sense that the filmmaker is God and he doesn't care if the people get your film. I don't subscribe to that notion. I always feel that, as you mentioned, there's investors, there's money. Like, filmmaking is a business, and people are expecting of you many things from your film. So you can't just go ahead and make your film as if you were doing a painting for yourself, right? Or taking a picture. I think cinema has to be also considered as business. So I'm very glad that you are looking, because for me, the worst thing that you can make is not really a bad film, whatever that means. It's very subjective, but I wouldn't want to make a boring film. And that's exactly what you spoke about, making a film that's a waste of time, where you just go out and say, okay, I got what he wanted to say, but I was bored. I did not invest. So I would either make a film that makes you angry, that takes you on a journey that maybe you don't enjoy it, but you at least got something out of it, that it was just a waste of time and you don't care about it. So I find it very refreshing that you go with this kind of thoughts as a filmmaker, because I think it's very important to respect the audience time, and also to create a dialogue with the film, through the film, with the audience. Like, the reason why it excites me for people to see Taxi is not just for them to see Taxi in a way, but I want them to talk to me about their experience watching Taxi. So it's so exciting for them to see. I'm still expecting, because, to be honest, I've never heard a negative reaction from someone. I would love to hear someone who didn't like the film, to understand why didn't he like it. But I would rather have that conversation,
Right.
than just throw something out in the world and don't care what happens. It's my problem with, like, the Netflix situation, where every week you have 5, 10 new different content, whether it's a series, whether it's a film, whether it's a documentary, whatever. And I feel that people, if it's not Stranger Things, if it's not the big movie of the week, it just gets lost. And I'm not sure if someone's watching. Maybe nobody's watching. But I don't like that Netflix doesn't care about that. I would rather see some feedback, see some comments from the people watching the films, than just assume that people are watching it. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, that is such a huge conversation topic about streaming and the way we are consuming films. Um, I don't know. I always feel that change is good. I'm a bit tired of the old model of, you know, the big Hollywood studios running cineplexes around the world, telling us what to watch. And then I remember growing up, maybe not growing up, maybe in my 20s or late teens, you get one film poster in the cineplex with a laurel on it that says Cannes or something. And then that's the only so-called non-Hollywood studio film you watch the entire year. But at least now we have options. I always think options are good. So there are, I don't know how many films there are on Netflix, maybe like 20,000 or something. But I don't really care that they're not promoting this film that nobody watches, but I happen to enjoy. I mean, I care about it in a general discussion about where we are going towards as a society consuming films. But as a consumer, as long as I have options, I'm just thankful for it. I think the world is getting so fragmented in every way that we can't really have one platform and one channel and one genre to fit everyone anymore. There are so many groups and subgroups of subgroups that wants that niche film. And I think as long as everyone gets to have a chance to enjoy what they can enjoy, then I think it's a win for now. Whether this pattern leads to something favorable for society and for films is, I think, a different conversation.
So, in that the same vein of the streaming, do you think it's easier or harder for documentaries to reach an audience right now?
It's easier. It's 100% easier. It may
Yeah,
not be the type of it may not be the type of documentaries you think represent quote unquote documentaries, but now I've got friends telling me I watch more documentaries than narrative fiction films, and that's only going to help documentaries. No matter what documentaries they consume, is because they get used to that genre of not being a fiction film, and that opens up their door to more and more different kinds of docs, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and another maybe controversial subject, I don't know, but every since you started working on your feature length films, you've been selected for very important festivals worldwide, sort of Hot Dogs, Sheffield, CPH Docs, like big documentary festivals. What do you think is like, or what do you feel is the importance of film festivals, especially for young filmmakers? Is it very important, film festivals, or is it just like irrelevant?
I think there is a place for film festivals before, and there is still a place for film festivals today. But in terms of their importance, I'm not sure whether they are as important. I mean, I go back and forth like, oh, maybe they are more important because they're becoming less important. I think it all depends as a filmmaker what resources you need. I think most filmmakers need festivals to gain prominence for themselves and for their films. So that's the most direct way. If you're a nobody, obviously, if you're just a humble filmmaker like myself, that's your only platform. But then, so I used to attend all these pitches as a participant and even as a jury member, where you decide what films get money or get chosen to be screened in a festival. And it used to be, maybe just to put it in a pop culture um, equivalent. So back in 2002, if you remember how that was like life on Earth, there was American Idol. So before American Idol, if you want to be a recording artist, you have to do demos and go to parties and hope your demo tape reaches the right person, that then reaches the right person in the studio. But then when American Idol came up, every random participant started getting fame or that 15 minutes that they can monetize and further their career with. So that was the maybe the film festival equivalent for the past X number of decades. And then for American Idol, now there's so many such competition shows that people forget and stop watching. And then YouTube came along. So if you get enough hits, you can bypass those conventional ways of getting fame to get a recording contract as a recording artist. And then now obviously you have TikTok and whatnot. So with film festivals, I feel like right now there are other ways that you can get prominence and contacts and networks. It's still a tried and tested way, but I feel like the pitching for money at a documentary, you pitch to BBC, you pitch to RT, NHK, just so that 2 years later maybe they give you some money, is already on its way out because of Netflix and Amazon and all these other platforms that offer better money faster and to more people. So it depends on really what you're looking for. If your end game is just to make a film, then maybe a certain way is better. If your end game is to be part of a community, to foster ties with your peers and to support each other's work, then maybe there's another method for you. So for me, I'm still finding what my next path is going to be. I'm still doing what I have been doing, but maybe taking my foot off the pedal, the gas for some of the ways because they are not um, turning out to be as rewarding as they used to be.
Yeah, I think everything is changing, including festivals, and even we have to talk about the pandemic, which affected everyone, obviously, but certainly the festival. The way we went to a particular city that they had the festivals, run into a filmmaker, had the networking, everything changed because we couldn't go out of our home. So I find it that the whole streaming thing, it took out the whole, I don't know, the special event type of thing that the festivals, well, I enjoy going as as an audience member to see those films and get excited with an audience, because if you're watching a film by yourself, it doesn't there's no difference between watching Sundance at home or watching Netflix or watching Amazon. It all becomes this some sort of like streaming sameness that, I don't know, it feels less special, even if you're
Right.
watching a premiere or you're watching a particular type of film. For me, there's no difference. So I really hope that we can go back to as we were making it, but I'm also thinking that we need to change. There are certain things about festivals that I don't like. I don't like the whole, oh, the laurels of you were selected or the premieres. I think it works as a marketing ploy for certain filmmakers and certain films, but it's not doing anything for documentaries. I feel that if you are fighting for a premiere, you're only taking away from a certain audience that cannot afford to go to that festival. And instead of just sharing the film amongst 5 or 6 festivals around the country, let's say in Mexico, you're just focusing on the big one, maybe in Guadalajara or Morelia, and you are like, okay, there's going to be an audience, but what if only 50 people saw it in Guadalajara, but since you wanted it to be a premiere, you took out the possibility that other states could watch the film at the same time because you imposed that, and it doesn't help on a documentary. It really doesn't. Maybe if you were watching the new Ryan Gosling film and you wanted that premiere, I can understand that you want the red carpet, you want the event, you want the media coverage, but it's not doing any favors for documentaries. So I have a lot of conflicts with festivals in that sense. But talking about festivals, Mac, have you noticed like whenever Taxi or one of your past films were either screening in Europe, screening in Asia, screening in America, in North America, South America, were there any cultural differences from the audiences? That, for example, do certain audiences get something, like Mexican audiences get something from Taxi that someone in India or in Europe doesn't get from the film?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there are differences, but I wasn't surprised that the differences were quite major. So there are countries where I can get a sense whether my film would do well in terms of audience reaction. And by do well, I just mean, do I get good Q&As? Do I get the seats in the hall filled up? So after a while, you can kind of guess. Like, and usually, if the film responds well to an audience there, the film would do well in that country generally in festivals and all that. So um, when Taxi was screened in Mexico, it was so close to home for audience members that the response was out of this world, like out of this world. I remember we were screening in an amphitheater in Puerto Vallarta, outdoors amphitheater in a public square, and it was evening, and people were just abuelas. Everyone was just sitting down, having dinner, playing with grandkids. You know, I imagine a mostly straight, heterosexual demographic. And then you have this film about a male survivor who was sexually assaulted by men. Um, and then you start realizing that, whoa, they care, because the amphitheater started getting full, and all the kids were still playing with their bubbles, whatnot. But all the men, the uncles, the grandmothers, they're all sitting down and just glued to the big screen. And then the Q&A lasted for an hour and a half. People were angry about what's happening in their country, in their society. People were emotional. People were triggered. So the experience for me as a filmmaker, it was very visceral. Everything was so close to home that everyone has an opinion, has an emotional reaction. And then if you go to a different continent, outside of the Americas, then it's slightly different. But then you go to the US, you just go, so I went to Wisconsin, and it wasn't particularly known for a huge Hispanic community or Mexican community. But then the reaction I got was so strong because there were few audience members who are sexual assault survivors, and one of them was female, and she was, in tears when she approached me and said, "Because of this film, I'm going to tell my parents this weekend what happened to me." So there are threads that will resonate with audience members in terms of demographic, in terms of experiences, similar to those of the characters in the film. So it is quite exciting just to go to a festival and just going, is the hall going to fill up? How is the Q&A going to be like? That's always something I enjoy when I attend festivals.
Yeah, for me it was like really special, the one Taxi, and I think we can focus on Taxi because I wanted to first of all cherish the experience that we had, not only making it in a sense, but also just taking it, starting from Guadalajara, where we had that world premiere, and then all the festivals that I even went by myself, which was quite an experience. But I find it like I've never been confronted with very deep emotions from audience members, and for me, it's something that I think treasure my whole life, because it's very uncomfortable, first of all, to have someone in an audience, like in one of the screenings in Guadalajara, to come and to say, I've never told anybody about this, but I feel Eric's journey opened something within me where I'm ready. And for your film to have that type of connection with someone, and to share that moment in tears with that person, is just so strong, and it doesn't really compare to anything else. So for me, it's something that I still find hard whenever the film is screened. I wasn't there on the screenings, for example, in the one where you saw the students, that there were hundreds of students and they were chanting Eric's name, and even Eric took him by surprise because he felt like he was sort of this pop star or something, right? And to be seen by so many people and to feel kind of love and to be grateful, even when we were doing the three screenings within the film, on the ending in Guadalajara, in Mexico City, in Querétaro, the ones in Guadalajara and the ones in Mexico City, especially, where when we had the whole family there for the Q&A, they were super emotional. They were something that for me, it's just so strange that a film can have that power. I don't know if you were surprised by it, or were you expecting it when we showed the film?
I was expecting it, but you don't really know whether you would get those kind of reactions. I mean, you're right. I mean, those moments, that the honor of being in that same space, to see people be vulnerable and to express something that they have locked up deep inside them for years because they felt shame. It's priceless. And I feel that's the power of documentary films. Um, Not to say they're more powerful than other films, but because they are so quote unquote real, um, you're watching people experiences unfold on screen, and then that I can't think of another genre of media or anything in the world that allows you to vicariously experience someone's life that intimately. And then obviously with documentary films, that someone else's life is a real life. It's not an action hero or someone conjured for your experience. It's a real person's experience. And then for you to be able to tap into that and then for it to have an impact on your life, I mean, that is, as a filmmaker, I think that's the biggest gift I've received from Taxi. Um, yeah, I always treasure those interactions I've had with audience members.
Yeah, and that's a little bit of what I've missed from the in-person screenings. Like I know that we need to talk about that. These are whenever this comes out on my channel, it's going to be just a few more days where you're going to be able to see Taxi and Filming Latino if you are in Mexico, obviously. But I would really like for the film to be seen, and whether that happens or not, well, we just need to see, because maybe some fateful decision will make the film available commercially in cinemas or available in a streaming platform, which is fine, because as you said before, people are consuming more than ever documentary cinema, and that's thanks to Netflix. And maybe they're just consuming true crime, which is the most addictive form of media content right now for documentaries, but at least it's documentaries, and at least someone will maybe give a chance to other type of documentaries, right? Not only true crime. But I think we're closing this conversation. I mean, it was great to talk to you, Mac. Hopefully we can do this very soon in person, because
Yes.
the pandemic has been just like something that, I mean, there's no, like, at this moment in time, I'm just dying to see people face to face, hug them, talk about anything. So hopefully we can talk soon about it, and whatever also comes in the future, because I'm sure you're working in projects, right? I wanted to ask you if there was any, maybe you can talk about it. If not, it's okay. But have you thought about buying happiness as a next project, or is that still sort of like a pause?
So that is one of the next projects. Um, I have more or less decided it's going to be released. It's going to see the world in 2028.
Okay. Oh my God. Yeah.
So it's 6 years from now. Um, so for listeners who to get some context, so I started making this film um, sort of since 2004. It is the first film I'm going to make where I am in the film, whether it's through my voice or whether it's through my physical self. And it's about my experience. So it's going to be very exciting for me. And 2028, it's going to be a milestone year in my life. I'm going to be turning 50, and I would have known the characters in my film for half my life, which is 25 years. And these characters were orphans I met when I was volunteering. So they were kids, and now they're all, full grown ups. So it would be an exciting story to tell, to see what extra clarity I get in the years to come to be able to bring that to the story and to the film.
I feel that's going to be sort of like your boyhood or experiment,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
maybe like the series 7 Up by Michael Apted, that he visits every 7 years the same people. So it's fascinating, and that's also something that documentary is very good at. Like, you can condense decades and make it a film, or maybe a TV series. I don't know, but I think the way that we experience time within documentary cinema is also very fascinating, because I mean, you're watching One Taxi Ride and it's almost 4 years of a man's life, but it doesn't feel like 4 years when you're watching the film. It's I mean, there's
Right.
obviously time gaps, and you can always tell that Eric's painting his hair differently, so there's obviously that those markations, time, passes, but you are so invested in a story that time flies literally, right? It just feels like you're just experiencing that. So I don't know if this project is gonna be like you experiencing, I don't know if it's gonna be like a time capsule of you, but also the audience experiencing this story through you. So I'm very
Right.
excited for it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm super excited too. Trying to manage my expectations, but I mean, I think it's going to be, yeah, my biggest film, quote unquote, biggest in terms of emotional attachment, in terms of time spent, resources spent making it.
Yeah, so we'll be very excited in 2028. I mean, it feels like a long time, but it's not really. Like, we've already had 2 years in the pandemic that feels just like flew by, right?
I know, I know.
So Mac, I wanted to just say thank you for this interview, this chat. I mean, it's an honor and a pleasure always to talk to you. And just tell the audience, Taxi, it's going to be a few days in Filming Latino. Just keep up with our social media accounts. You're probably going to be able to see it later on. So we'll be updating our websites and all social medias. So you can, if you have not seen it yet, please see it before it goes out of Filming Latino. But we will be continuing this journey with Taxi. But thank you so much, Mac.
Thank you so much, Roman. Really enjoy doing this with you.